Is it recording?
Yeah, it's recording.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. So today we'll have Shaykh Waleed will be discussing topic for from now until 4. We'll take a break around 2:45 for Asr, inshallah, and then we'll resume inshallah at 3. And for the last hour we'll also try to include some time for questions. Then we will resume tonight from 7 to 9 p.m. With a lecture. That one will be focused on Ihya al-Din and the concept of remembrance in there. Shaykh Waleed will go through in more detail as to the content of today's session, and also he'll introduce the evening session tonight. And then the last session will be tomorrow morning from 9 to 10:30. So we'll go through in more detail how tomorrow's schedule will be adjusted with the Arabic and evening session, since Shaykh Waleed will have to leave in the morning after his session. So 9 to 10:30 tomorrow again we'll have Shaykh Waleed, and he'll finish the topic that he is starting today in the afternoon session. So.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا وحبيبنا وقرة أعيننا سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين ثم أما بعد. So what we're going to try to do here is go in a kind of logical order. So if you have your course packets, this will be reading from the section not from the Ihya but from Miftah al-Falah of Ibn Ata'illah Secondary.
So it's the 7th tab. 7th tab. Yeah, it should look like this. Yeah, not that one. Next tab. Flip the whole tab.
Has everyone got it? If you don't, raise your hand and Samira will help. So, this text called Miftah al-Falah, and I think something like Allah, was written by Imam Ibn Ata'illah, Ahmed ibn Ata'illah Secondary, and he was an Egyptian scholar originally from North Africa, Morocco, and he lived in the 8th century of the Hijrah, approximately. And he was more or less credited with being not the originator of the Shadili tariqa, but rather the one who articulated the particular path. Because the first two, Abu Hassan al-Shadili and then his student Abu al-Abbas al-Mursi, didn't really leave much in terms of written works. They left behind some awrad, adhkar, so forth, but they didn't leave anything that really expounded upon what this particular path was all about. So So Ibn Ata al-Sakandari is considered to be one of the most important early articulators of this particular path. I don't want to get too much into all of that, but just to give you some background about it. And all of these paths, whichever name they take, generally make dhikr or remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a central tenet. And in fact, it's a central tenet of Islam. It's not something that's unique to a particular path, but these paths sort of particularize what was made general in the Sunnah. And so they take the adhkar, the awrad that the Prophet ﷺ said, and then they kind of formulate them in a way for people to appreciate and to practice daily. And then usually it's in the form of what we call a wird, which would be a daily litany of remembrances either of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or the Prophet ﷺ. Could also be parts of the Quran. So in this particular treatise, Imam Ibn Ata, he's talking specifically about dhikr and its importance, how it's practiced, and some of the benefits, and so forth. Now, most works of this nature that were written in pre-modern times, they usually go in a very methodical way, logical way, and so they start off with talking about what something is, defining it. So our ulama, they're very big on defining things first and then taking it from there. So if you read the unwan, right, and unwan is the word for chapter title. It's also the same word for address, like house address. So don't get confused if you say, you know, what's his unwan, where does he live? Also, unwan also means a chapter title. مقدمة في ماهية الذكر وبيانه. So the muqaddimah, it's an introduction. It's introducing this thing. And it comes from the same word as qadam, which means foot, right? And when you walk, what do you put forward first? Your foot. So the muqaddimah is indicating that this is what comes first. في ماهية الذكر. Now this word mahiya is interesting because it's what we call kalima manhuta min al-naht. Al-naht means you mix two words together and make a new word out of it. Like in English, I think we have something like
contraction. Whereas. Whereas.
Whereas, or no, I'm trying to think something like more colloquial. What do we say?
Y'all.
No.
Compound word.
Like a compound word. Like Fuddruckers or something. You know, it's not really a word, but Fuddruckers have made it one word. Fuddruckers. So mahiya comes from ma and hiya. What is it, right? What's ma is a istifham, what? And then hiya, what is that? Hiya, as you know in the Arabic language, we don't have really the word for it. It's either masculine or feminine, and then for non-human plural, or things that are singular but designated as feminine, we use the feminine. So hiya, ma hiya. So that's what it's called, kalima manhuta, ma hiya. So it literally means the what is it. In other words, define it. They have a fancy word in English, they call it quiddity, but don't worry about that. Or the essence of something, which is very closely related. So mahiyat dhikr, what is dhikr? What are we talking about here? What we're trying to say? Wa bayanuhu, right? And the bayan means to explain it, right? And in Arabic language, generally speaking, when you have al-atf al-ma'tuf, that means that the thing coming that's ma'tuf is different than the one before. So bayan doesn't mean the same thing as mahiyya. It's two different things. So mahiyya is what is it? And the bayan is, tell me more about it. Right? And bayan, al-shaykh al-bayin means the thing that is clear. So clearing something up or explicating it, explaining it, giving more details about it, this would be called the bayan. Qur'anun Arabiyyun Mubin, same word, right? A clear Qur'an, Arabic Qur'an, Mubin, right? And when Fir'aun wanted to revile with Moses, he said, وَلَا يَكَادُ يَبْنِي, right? وَلَا يَكَادُ يُبِي. He barely knows how to make bayan. He barely knows how to speak. Same word, bayan. So he says, rahimahullah, وَنَفْعَنْ بِعُلُومٍ فِي الدَّارَيْنِ آمِينَ الذِّكْرُ هو. Right now you can tell definition. He's giving us a definition. So he begins with a dhikr. Then obviously, in traditional texts, you didn't actually have these punctuation marks. That's something that came later on. And as you can see, there's no diacritical marks either. Tashkeel. When you open the Quran, the Mus'haf, it's kind of, gives me fatha where it's supposed to be, and kasra and sukun and so forth. But here you don't have that. And even the original Masahif didn't have that either. Tashkeel was something that came actually a few hundred years later. It didn't come in the beginning. Even the dots themselves, like the dot under the bat, the one dot under the bat, or the two above the dat, or the three above the that, and so forth, that wasn't there either. So you're probably scratching your head like, well, how do people know how to read it? How'd that work? How could they tell the bat from the dat from the that, the dot from the sad? Because they're written the same except for some dots. And the answer to that is the very act of reading the Arabic language is an interpretive act. You have to interpret while you're reading. In other words, there's a very close association with what's written and how it's supposed to sound out when you actually say it. When Jibreel went to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in Hira, when he retreats, and he said, Iqra. We usually translate that as read, right? But he didn't have a text. He didn't take a book and say, read this. He didn't mean that. He actually meant recite, right? Because Iqra, or recite, or read, means to articulate, to expound on what's already a meaning in the heart. So language in general is a means, it's sort of a level of formalism that expounds upon thoughts, ideas. Why the emphasis on this? So Islam is a religion of knowledge. In other words, we need to have access and understand thoughts that came before us, ideas where the articulator of such ideas is no longer with us, or can't speak to us in an oral sense. So the written word is a means, it's an aid by which to get to that. So in other words, the oral tradition is more primary than the written one. There are some linguists out there who say that, for example, there are certain languages in the world that continue today that are only oral. They don't have a written language. And they're seen as sort of more primitive than ones that also have a written tradition, which may or may not be the case. Because if we consider the oral tradition to be primary and the written one merely as an aid to help that oral tradition, then the oral one is the one we should be talking about. That's the one that's more important. So hence the emphasis, if you look at how knowledge was disseminated, throughout our history, you see a strong emphasis on the idea of sama' and audition, or hearing it, not just reading it. So the hadith masters, for example, when they would be transmitting their hadith, the weakest form of transmission, it's a valid form, but the weakest form is what they call al-munawala, or the ijaza bil-kitaba, where I have my book of hadith and I hand it to you, and I say, I give you the ijaza to narrate these hadith. But you didn't actually hear them from me. I didn't read them before you, nor did you read them before me, which are the two strongest methods. So the two strongest methods, and there's some difference of opinion on which one is stronger. Either the Shaykh is reading the hadith and everyone is listening, or a student is reading the hadith and the Shaykh is correcting him as he reads. Those are the two strongest. Why? Because there's that idea of audition, and the interpretation that's inherent in understanding the language is being transmitted as well. Now nowadays we have people reading things and they don't have any access to that, and all sorts of mistakes happen as a result. And sometimes they're almost like a comedy. How interesting these mistakes can be. I'll give you a few examples just to digress a little bit. I was told by a close friend of mine who went to a particular country where they were burying a deceased person, someone who had died. And there's a particular method to do that in our tradition, how we build the grave. There's two types of something called the shaq, another one called the lahad, where you actually dig, and then you have these brick-like blocks that cover up, and then you put the dirt and so forth. And so he was there, and they threw some dirt, and then these 4 guys came out with this big, huge, vessel, like a big, huge pot full of milk. And so they're bringing it, and they dump the milk on the grave. So I've never heard of that. So after, he asked them, what is that? Why are you doing that? And what's the idea with the milk? He's like, well, we read in the books of fiqh that after the grave was built, يُضَعَ اللَّبَنْ فوق اللحم. That the leban should be put on top of the grave. It's like, it's not leban, it's lebin. Leban, lam, bi, ba, noon, is fatha, right? Leban. Lebin, lam has fatha and the ba has kasra. And that's the plural of the word labina. Labina means brick, like clay brick. Leban means milk. Leban means milk. So because of that just little mistake in fatha and kasra, they did something completely different. Then there's another one that one of my teachers told me that I always tell this one. 2 men were riding, one was on his camel, the other one was on the other camel, and they're on their way, and then they meet up and they said, oh, are you going in the same direction? Yeah, okay, let's ride together. And so they started to ride together, and then the man in the front was leading, then there was a man in the back. So the man in the front, he got a little thirsty, so he wanted to stop. So he yelled to the man in the back. He said, "Atishta, atishta," and the man in the back said, "La, no." He said, "Why does he want me to stop?" Okay, fine. Maybe he wants to make some pace before nightfall. Okay, let's continue. So he continued. An hour later, he's really having a hard time with his thirst. He went back. He said, "Atishta." He's like, "La." Again, he said, "No." What's the story with this guy? So they continue, and then an hour later, he's about to collapse from dehydration, and he actually falls off the camel and so forth. And the other man runs to him. He said, "What's the problem?" He's like, "Atishta." He's like, "No, you want to say atishtu, not atishta." He's like, "Qatalatka damma." Because if you're saying I am thirsty, right, the pronoun has to have a what? Damma. You say atishtu. But if you say you are thirsty, then he's like asking a question. Atishta, are you thirsty? And he said, no, I'm not. La, I'm not thirsty. So just kasra dhamma can make a whole difference, changing the meaning. So the reading of the Arabic itself, it's an interpretive exercise. That's why the emphasis on audition and understanding the rules of morphology and grammar. Otherwise, you won't know what the meanings are. So Imam Ibn Ata al-Sakandari says, "Al-dhikru," right? What is dhikr? هو التخلص من الغفلة والنسيان بدوام حضور القلب مع الحق. And this type of definition, it might fall under what's called the definition that's jama' and mana'. Jama' and mana'. So 2 conditions for a true definition of defining something is it's jama' and mana'. Jama' means it includes all possible iterations and meanings or subspecies or groups of that particular definition. So if I say, for example, a dog is a 4-legged animal that has hair and eats dog food, which is a poor definition, right? Why is it a poor definition? Because there are other 4-legged animals that have hair that might eat dog food, right? Or there could be hairless dogs that don't fall under that definition that eat dog food. So I define it in a way that I did not include everything that's called a dog to begin with, and I didn't obviate or preclude everything that's not a dog. So the idea of definition is to include everything that would understand to be dhikr and exclude everything that's not. So he says here, هو التخلص من الغفلة والنسيان بدوام حضور القلب مع الحق. He doesn't even mention here what you say. He didn't say هو حركة اللسان. He didn't say it's a movement of the tongue. He didn't say it's saying specific things. For him, it's a state, right? And not just any state. it's a removal of something and a replacement with something else. Why did I say removal, replacement? Because he says, how at-takhallus. What's takhallus? Getting rid of something. Right? At-takhallus actually means like finally getting rid of something. Right? It's not just mere removal. Takhallus means it's kind of the inherent in the meaning of the word is a struggle involved about removing this thing. At-takhallus min al-ghafla wal-nisyan. So removing what? Getting rid of what? Two things. Ghafla and nisyan. Do they mean the same thing? What's the difference?
Ghafla is like heedlessness, not aware of what's around you.
Mm-hmm.
And nisyan, forgetfulness.
Okay.
One is intentional, the other is
Makes sense. Anyone else? They could mean the same thing, or they have, there are shades of meaning that are close, but generally, ghafla means something that might be more steady, permanent, in a state of ghafla. You don't really say state of nisyan. Whereas nisyan comes back and forth. I forgot something. But it means that I can recollect afterwards. But ghafla is ashad. Ghafla can be worse, because ghafla can be something where it's kind of who you are. Insan ghafil or mutaghaffil. We don't really say hada insan nasi, or we would say kathir nisyan, right? We say kathir nisyan, he forgets a lot, but it's not something that to describe someone that happens to a lot, but someone who's ghafil or mutaghaffil, that's kind of who they are. So either way, whether it's iterant forgetfulness or something that's more stagnant with someone, both of those need to be removed. With what? Or how? In ba hina, when you get to higher level Arabic, you'll find that there are even whole separate books written about what we call huruf al-ma'ani. These little prepositional letters like the ba, like min, fi, ila, ala. All of these are called huruf al-ma'ani. Why huruf al-ma'ani, the letters of meaning? Because they carry different connotations and meanings depending on how they're used in the sentence. So here, التخلص من الغفلة والنسيان بدوام. So this ba, I'm thinking to myself, what does he mean? Is it ba al-isti'ana? Is it za'ida? Is it something else? So forth. So here, like when we say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, that's a ba in the beginning, right? What am I doing with the basmala? What is it that I'm doing? ممكن أستعين, أبتدئ, right? And that's a whole other discussion, because actually Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, as I attended in one of the classes today, it's not actually a sentence by itself. You have to make taqdeer, or figure out where the missing part, the omitted part. So هناك إما فعل أو خبر أو مبتدأ محذوف. Mahذuf means omitted. Again, I'm interpreting, because when I say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the most gracious, the most compassionate, or merciful, what am I doing? It's not a complete idea. What is it about that? So they said, أبتدئ ابتدائي كذا يعني, I start with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And even someone said, whatever I'm about to do, that's my fi'l. That's the verb I should put in. So if I'm about to start the ignition to my car, I would say, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, I أتحرك, or شغل سيارتي, or whatever. That's the thing, whatever particular activity that you're doing, the basmala will apply to. So here the ba, بدوام حضور القلب. So this ba is answering the question of how, كيف. How do I get rid of ghafla and nisyan? بدوام حضور القلب. And actually, certain verbs will take on certain huruf ma'ani, and sometimes they don't. Most beginning students in Arabic, they'll make that mistake, like they'll translate the English and then they'll use the wrong harf al-ma'na in the wrong place, so it sounds a little funny to people who may be native Arabic speakers. And sometimes depending upon which letter you use, the meaning can completely change, completely be different. Like for example, the word raghiba. Raghiba means to desire in general. Raghibtu fi kada, I want this, I'm looking for this. So when you say raghibtu fi al-ilhaq bi mahad Fawakih, I desire us to study with the Fawakih Institute. Raghibtu fi, that means I want to. But if I say raghibtu an al-ilhaq bi mahad Fawakih, it's the opposite. It means I don't want to, because I changed. An means I don't want to do it. رغبت عنها, يعني I'm pushing myself away from it. لا رغبت فيها. وهكذا. So the harf ma'na is very important. The harf ma'na, even ayat al-wudu is probably the best example. Why do all the schools of thought differ about how much you should wipe up your head, whether it's like part of it or all your head and so forth? Because of the ba. That's the only reason. When it says in the ayah in Surah Al-Ma'idah, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِذَا قُمْتُمْ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ فَاغْسِلُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ وَأَيْدِيَكُمْ إِلَى الْمَرَافِقِ وَامْسَحُوا. What's next? بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ. So it means wipe and then the ba with your heads. 4 different interpretations of what that means. The ba. Imam al-Shafi'i said the ba للتبعيد. Tabaid means what? Ba'd, part of. So it means wipe part of your head. That's Imam al-Shafi'i. Imam Malik said la, za'ida. Za'ida means extraneous, but not extraneous in terms of that it shouldn't be there, but you are to understand it as if it's not there. So it would be wamsahu ru'usakum, wipe your heads. In other words, your whole head. So Imam Malik said wipe your whole head. Imam Abu Hanifa said la, ba' lil-ilsaq. Ilsaq means 2 things touching one another. So he's saying it's as if you're wiping your hand with your head. So then he said the 4-finger thing, to wipe that much, that part. Those are the schools of thought, all because of the ba, what they thought the ba. Is any one of those interpretations absolutely conclusive that you can exclude the others? No. Why not? Because all 3 usages are there in the Arabic language. How do we understand the meanings of the Quran or the meanings of the Hadith to begin with? How the usage was. Why did Imam Ibn Abbas, what did he say when, sometimes, and it's interesting, when he debated with the Khawarij. The Khawarij were the literalists of their time. In other words, their main issue was how they interpret the Quran. And what it led to afterwards with the language and the understanding of the language. So here, من الغفلة والنسيان بدوام حضور القلب. By the, how are we going to get rid of this? By the steadfastness, dawam, or continuity of the hudur of the qalb. The steadfastness, hadara means to be present, right? Hadartu means I was present. So the hudur means the presence of the heart, ma'al haqq, with the haqq. Who's the haqq? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why did he say haqq? He could have said any of the other names of Allah. He could have said ma'allah, could have said ma'al Rabb, could have said ma'al Rahman, could have said ma'al Rahim. Why do you think he would say ma'al haqq, that particular name? Based upon the definition. And I'll give you a hint. It has something to do with takhallus and ghafla and nisyan.
Moving batin.
Exactly. Right? Because kullu ma siwa Allah batil. Everything except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, really in comparison to Him, is nothing. It's batil. So if haqq is the truth and the ultimate truth, and Allah is that, and it's one of His names, then everything else is nothing. Everything else is nothing compared to Him. So hudur al-qalb ma'al haqq means also adam al-hudur ma'al batil. Right? We call this mafhum al-mukhalafa. When you state something, then its negative also becomes implicitly understood. So if I'm with God, I'm with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that means I'm not with all this other stuff. Right? Alhaakum at-takathur. What's takathur? Multiplicity, the multitudes. Alhaakum, distracted you. But al-haq is one. That's tawheed, right? La ilaha. That's the khallus in the beginning, right? La ilaha, no God. You're negating all forms, all of the things that people can possibly take to be a God, or take to be the receptacle of their dreams and their aspirations and their hopes and all of this, and saying none of that is relevant. La ilaha illallah, except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the Islamic paradigm is giving us what's called, we call it takhallus sometimes, we call it nafi, we'll call it takhliya. Takhliya means an emptying out of something, and then removing that and replacing it with what's important. Tahliya. And tahliya is putting what is sweet, what is right, what is proper, what is haqq. So again, وَالتَّخَلُّصُ مِنَ الْغَفْلَةِ وَالنِّسْيَانِ, those two things, either temporary or permanent states of disremembrance, such a word exists, بِدَوَامِ حُضُورِ الْقَلْبِ, by the constant presence of heart with al-haqq, with Allah. Now that definition is kind of general, because you can put almost anything under that that's going to help you to lead you to that. And in fact, that's the approach, and we're going to see this in this paragraph, that Ibn Ata'illah al-Sikandari takes. That it's not just saying subhanallah, subhanallah, that's a type of dhikr, but it's not the only type, and maybe it's not even the most important or powerful type. Then he says, وَقِيلَ. What type of word is qila?
Passive.
Passive voice. So it's from the verb qal, right? But because it's mujawwaf, yani the middle letter is harf illa, then it has a different form. Qila. And in the traditional methodology, we also call qila sighat tamrid. Sighat tamrid. What does that mean? It means, for example, when I use the passive voice, especially when I am listing some opinions, and if I say, he says here, dhikr is this, this, and this, and this person said this, then he says, وَقِيلَ كَذَا, وَقِيلَ, and it's been said. Sighat tamrid means he doesn't have as much confidence in the second opinion as the one he already stated earlier. He's throwing it out there. The qila means it's throwing it out there, like it's an opinion.
Sighat
Tamrid. From marada. Marada means to be sick, right? And marid is a sick person. So when we say sighat tamrid, we say it's a form of, maybe I don't know how to translate that, but just giving it like a lesser significance than the original.
weakness.
Yeah, it's not. Doesn't mean it's completely weak, like, because he would, if he thought that, he wouldn't even mention it. Doesn't mean it's to be discarded, but what it does mean is it's weaker, or it's another opinion that is lesser than the one he stated first. Otherwise, he would have put the second one first, and the first one second. So he says, وَقِيلَ تَرْتِيلُ اسم المذكور بالقلب واللسان. Tardid, and raddada means to repeat. Ism al-madhkur, the name of the one being remembered, namely Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, bil-qalbi wal-lisan, with the heart and with the tongue. So why do you think he said qila for this one? He didn't put it first. Because that makes sense too. It's a good definition. Sounds like dhikr to me. He didn't just say what you say with your tongue, but he said bil-qalbi wal-lisan, heart and tongue. What do you think?
I think that there's other types of dhikr. He's trying to be a little limit the definition.
The second one is a little bit limiting, right? Whereas the first one is more expansive. So my interpretation, he put it that way because he found it limiting, and he rather put the more expansive, comprehensive definition first. And then he kind of explains why when he goes through the list here of what he thinks dhikr is. So he says, وَسَوَاءً فِي ذَلِكَ ذِكْرُ اللَّهِ أَوْ صِفَةٌ مِّن صِفَاتِهِ, whether you mention Allah's name, specifically Allah, or an attribute from amongst His attributes. أو حكم من أحكامه أو فعل من أفعاله أو استدلال على شيء من ذلك, right? Or a ruling from amongst His rulings, His commands, or an act from amongst His acts. أو الاستدلال على شيء من ذلك, or to indicate or point to something of those things. This is much more than the second definition. أو دعاء, right? Or dua, or supplication. أو ذكر رسله أو أنبيائه أو أوليائه, right? Or remembering His prophet, His messengers, His prophets, or some from amongst His awliya. أو من انتسب إليه أو تقرب إليه بوجه من الوجوه. إلى من here? What is this إليه? Where is this hat going back to? انتسب إلى من? Affiliated with whom? انتسب means to be affiliated with. انتسب إلى Allah, right? Because it can't, if it was to be the prophets or the messengers or anything of the other things, it would have been plural. Because usually we say الضمير يعود على أقرب مذكور. Usually the pronoun goes back to the one that was mentioned closest and latest. But here it's clear that it's pointing back to انتسب إلى من? إلى Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. أو تقرب إليه بوجه من الوجوه, or gets close to إليه من, Allah, some way. وجها من الوجوه. That's very general. From some aspect, from amongst many aspects. أو سبب من الأسباب, or by a cause from amongst the many causes. أو فعل من الأفعال, or an act amongst the many acts. بنحو قراءة أو ذكر. By reading here, قراءة generally means قراءة القرآن, generally speaking. أو ذكر, a type of remembrance of the tongue. أو شعر أو غناء, or poetry or singing. Right, and you see here the muhaqqiq is the editor. He got a little afraid of this last thing he said here, that people might misinterpret it, even though I don't think it's something we should worry about too much. But he says here, كأن يتغنى بإشعار فيها تذكير وحضور مع الله كما هو حال السلف لا الغناء المحرم. Right? So he's saying, wait, guys, slow down. When he says singing, he's not talking about Britney Spears. Whoa, slow. He's talking about anything that has poetry, that has remembrance of God and presence with Him, as was the state of the pious predecessors, Salaf. لا الغناء المحرم, not the haram singing. I'm not talking about that. But the thing is, to me, if the singing is bringing you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then how can something that Allah made haram bring you closer to Him? It's not possible. So to me it's kind of superfluous to even say that. Mine. أو محاضرة أو حكاية, or a lecture or a story. فالمتكلم ذاكر. والمتفقه ذاكر. And here he put the right footnote. Obviously I'm not judging him, but the idea here is when he said after it al-mutafaqih, because mutakallim means the one who is speaking, generally in the general usage of the term. But al-mutakallim also means the one who is versed in kalam theology. It's called mutakallim. So someone, he says, even who's studying ilm al-kalam, or studying theology, or one who is well versed in it, that is a type of dhikr, because it's a means by which he's growing closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَالْمُتَفَقِّهِ, the one who's studying fiqh, or the one who has studied fiqh, ذاكر. وَالْمُدَرِّسُ ذاكر, and the teacher. وَالْمُفْتي, one who gives fatwa. وَالْوَاعِظ, the one who gives advice and admonishes, a general preacher. والمتفكر في عظمة الله تعالى وجلاله وجبروته وآياته في أرضه وسماواته ذاكر. Right? So the mutafakkir, the contemplator, the reflective person, upon what? In the greatness, عظمة الله, وجلاله, his magnificence, his jabarut, these are similar terms, and his signs in his earth and the heavens, is a dhakir, someone remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَالْمُمْتَثِلُ مَا أَمَرَ اللَّهُ بِهِ وَالْمُنْتَهِي عَمَّا نَهَى عَنْهُ ذَاكِرٌ. مُمْتَثِلُ من الامتثال, right, means to obey here, but it comes from the idea that because mithli means like example. So someone is actually setting you an example, and then you are abiding by that example. So أنا امتثلت لأمره, I obeyed his command and the particular example that he wanted me to follow. So الممتثل ما أمر الله به, what Allah has commanded. والمنتهي من النهي, the one who has forbade or he himself has refrained. عما نهى عنه, what Allah has asked you to refrain from, is a dhakir. That's also someone who remembers Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Where did the second definition end?
واللسان وقيل تبديل اسم المذكور
Oh, it's just that verse.
القلب واللسان.
I see, okay. So everything else is,
And then وسواء في ذلك,
it's all of them.
it's like explaining both of them. So it would not make sense that he makes that all of that is from the first definition. So
Those are a lot of different things. I mean, I was thinking those are a lot of different things.
there's a lot of different things. So basically, the whole deen is dhikr, right? The whole deen is dhikr, and usually an issue like this is precipitated with talking a little bit about the nature of human being, actually, and his nafs and his soul, and how it's affected and so forth, which kind of put this into context. But maybe tonight, lecture, we'll get into that a little bit more. So, والذاكر, right? We said dhikr. Now we're talking about the dhakir, the one who actually does that. What form would we call that word? In that form like that? Ism al-fa'il, right? Ism al-fa'il. Fa'ala fa'ilu, right? الذاكر قد يكون اللسان. So it could be what? The tongue is the thing actually making the dhikr. He didn't say قد يكون باللسان. He said قد يكون اللسان, right? Could be the tongue itself. In other words, the tongue is making dhikr, sort of, and you're not so aware of it. And that can be understood in two ways. One of them is like mubtadi, the beginner, and one would be a muntahi, the one who's already on the later stage. So the mubtada, when he makes dhikr, or she makes dhikr, and he or she is doing it, saying subhanallah, subhanallah, and the tongue is there, but they're not, the hudur al-qalb is not really there yet. Like, it's not quite there. But Imam al-Sakandari, he actually encourages people, don't let that stop you, because he says this in the hikam. Right? He said that making dhikr without hudur is still better than not making dhikr at all. And shaitan will try to delude you. He'll say, you're sitting on the bus and you're playing the sibha, you're saying it, but you're thinking about, the movie you saw last night, or thinking about this. What type of dhikr is that? Just stop until you get yourself straight. So he's trying to give you advice, right? Something sounds helpful, that's his style, right? But it's not helpful. He's trying to delude you. So making dhikr with just the lisan, with just the tongue, even if you don't have presence of heart, is still better than not doing it at all. So that's one way to understand it. The other way to understand it is the one who's muntahi, the one who's in a higher state, their tongue may be moving because their heart is telling them to. It's like an almost involuntary action, because their heart is in a constant state of dhikr. And so now the heart is now in full control of everything else. So the heart may command the tongue, and the tongue moves, not because he's saying I have to make dhikr, but it's his natural state, and the tongue moves with it. That's different than the first one we're talking about. So with ذاكر قد يكون اللسان, could be the tongue. وقد يكون بالجنان, right? What is jinan? Who knows? Huh? Janan. If we said jinan, what's that mean? Like plural of gardens, which is not the same thing. So janan is the heart, but they all have a similar meaning, going back to a covering up of something or being unseen, like al-jinn, same thing. Jannah, jinn, jinan, janan, right? Because the heart is not seen, and I don't mean because it's inside your chest. I mean because it's the definition of heart here is not the physical heart, but the spiritual heart. And also the jinan, or plural of jannah, are it said that the ground is not seen because of the lush nature of the trees and the brush that cover it. That's where the jannah comes from. And the jinn, we know, can't be seen. And majnoon means someone, it doesn't really mean they're possessed by jinn, but that's kind of where the word majnoon
Their
came from.
intellect can't be seen.
Huh?
Their intellect can't be seen.
Yeah, that could be the two. That's another way to look at it. So it could be with the tongue, with the heart. وقد يكون بأعضاء الإنسان, and it can even be with the limbs. Dhikr can be with the limbs. Like the editor says here, when we pray and we make hajj, these are physical things. So Imam al-Ghazali in the Ahya, not here, but they're all very similar meanings, he talks about how the limbs, when they are moving in accordance with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded, then they begin to affect the heart themselves. So the certain way that we pray, the ritual order of the prayer is significant. It's not trivial. It's not, well, it could have been some other way. Let me just pray in the way that feels good to me. Some people say, but no, the prayer where there's a standing, there's ruku', there is sujood, all of those things are significant, and each one of them has a particular effect on the heart. Imam Ghazali expounds upon this a little bit when he talks about Asrar al-Salah, which is one of the chapters of that here. So, dhikr then is a comprehensive exercise. It's with the tongue, it's with the heart, and it's with the limbs. What's left? Right? That's basically everything about us. وقد يكون, next page, بالأعلان والإجهار والجامع لذلك كله ذاكر كامل. So بالأعلان وبالإجهار means
openly or announcement.
Yeah, أعلان means to do it openly or out loud, and ijhar is out loud. They're kind of a similar meaning. Because generally when we think of dhikr, we think it's silent. وَالْجَامِعُ لِذَلِكَ كُلِّهِ, and someone who combines all of these, ذَاكِرٌ كَامِلٌ. Right? And kamil means the one who has achieved something close to perfection. Actually means comprehensive. Something is kamil means it's complete. So that means that perfection, there's a certain completeness about it, comprehensiveness. Then he defines the ones that come after. فذكر اللسان هو ذكر الحروف بلا حضور مع ذكر الحروف بلا حضور وهو الذكر الظاهر وله فضل عظيم شهد به الآيات والأخبار والآثار. So the remembrance of the tongue ذكر الحروف بلا حضور. That's the remembrance of the letters, actually the utterance of the words, بلا حضور, without presence of heart necessarily. وهو ذكر الظاهر, right? And this is the outward, apparent dhikr. وله فضل عظيم. What's that mean? It has a great virtue. In other words, even if you're just saying it and you're not understanding it, or even it's not penetrating your heart, it's still good. It's still a virtuous thing to do. And Ibn Atta, he was of the opinion that if you don't start out that way, you will never get to the later one where it's the dhikr of the heart and the tongue together. So unless you go through that first, you may not get to the ones later. So you have to go through that initial stage of even just dhikr of the tongue. وله فضل عظيم شهدت به الآيات والأخبار والآثار. What's the difference between akhbar and athar? What's the singular of akhbar and athar? Khabar and athar. So what do they mean? Akhbar means yes.
The others to effect.
Athar, that would be ta'thir. Athar means something that remains of something. Athar shay, what remains of it. You will find that's why when you read text like this, sometimes the dictionary meaning doesn't give you what he's talking about, because these terms have become specialized in a sense. So for example, when we talk about ahadith and akhbar and athar, those are actually specialized terms amongst the ulama of hadith. So here, the implication is khabar is different than athar. So akhbar, in here he means that which includes hadith, authenticated hadith. In other words, things that are relating back to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. وَأَمَّا الْآثَارِ would be also types of reports, but not necessarily going back to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Maybe some of the Sahaba, Tabi'een, even later generations, we would call that athar. And that's actually the Ghazalian style. If you read the way he writes in Ihya, he comes in the beginning, he brings all of the relevant ayahs, then some of the relevant hadith, then he brings some of the athar and mansuba, some of the affiliated sayings and reports with people who came after the Sahaba. And that's kind of how our, to use a fancy word, epistemology works, but epistemology just means how we know what we know and our level of confidence in what we know. And so there's an implicit acknowledgement there that there are some things we're way more certain about than others, but that doesn't mean that we dismiss the things that we're not 100% certain about. So I can have 100% certainty about some things, and I have something less than that, but nevertheless, I still follow them as I follow the things that I may have 100% certainty about. What does that mean? Like, for example, we pray 5 prayers a day. Those of us who are fortunate enough to go to Mecca and pray there, and the Kaaba is right in front of me, I have to hit it dead on. I am not allowed to be off by a degree, because the Kaaba is in front of me. As long as I can see it, then I have to face it directly. Those of us who are far away, there's no way I can have 100% certainty that I'm facing the Kaaba directly, no matter how good your compass is. Right? It's not going to work. It's going to be an approximation. But nevertheless, I pray. And the implication, the understanding is my 5 prayers, at least in terms of me facing the direction of the Qibla, is accepted as long as I made an effort to face the Kaaba. That's all that's required of me. I don't need to have the 100% certainty that I actually faced it dead on. Why? Because it's mu'tadar, it's not possible. It would be an undue difficulty on the Ummah for me to have to face it directly when I'm outside of Mecca. Inside of Mecca is a different story, or the Kaaba, or the Haram, it's there in front of me. There's no excuse. So those things that are quite difficult, that where 100% certainty is difficult to find, then it's not required. But I still practice it in the same manner as if I did have 100% certainty. Does that make sense? Then he goes on to say فمنه المقيد بالزمان أو المكان. Should I say مقيد or مقيد? And what's the difference? Right. So what do you think here? اسم الفاعل?
Yeah.
Why?
It's referring back to Mosaad.
Is it? What's referring back to? Vic. You want to stay with that answer?
I think I still will stay with it.
Why?
Because it's the one that is.
Who's doing the taqeed? Taqeed means to do what? قيدت الشيء. What does that mean? Yeah, to qualify or limit to a particular thing. So he's saying qualifying or limited to a particular zaman, time or place.
Limited.
Huh?
It's limited by those things.
So it would be ism
Muqayyad.
maf'ul. Right. So muqayyad, يعني, in other words, delimited, probably the best word, delimited by zaman, time, ما لا يتقيد. والمطلق, he's saying, oh sorry, that's the paragraph. فمن المقيد بالزمان أو المكان. So that can be limited by zaman, time, أو مكان, place. So there are certain types of adhkar, I would say, in particular times or in particular places. ومنه المطلق. المطلق means unqualified. كان اسم مفعول. أطلقته فهو مطلق. فالمقيد كالذكر في الصلاة وعقبها. So like the ones we say during prayer and afterwards. Subhanallah, alhamdulillah, wa la ilaha illallah, wallahu akbar. Those are things that come right after the prayer. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah is a type of thing after the prayer in that particular instance. Wal hajj, and the particular adhkar in hajj. Wa qabla al-nawmi, wa ba'da al-yaqadha, before sleep. Like Allahumma bismika Allahumma amut wa ahya, or something like that. Wa ba'da al-yaqadha, alhamdulillah alladhi ahyana ba'da matana wa ilayhi nushur. وقبل الأكل البسملة وعند ركوب الدابة سبحان الذي سخر لنا هذا وطرفي النهار وغير ذلك. So before sleep, after waking up, before eating, when riding an animal, riding something. طرفي النهار. What word is that? طرفي, what is that?
Two ends.
Two ends. Where did the noon go? It shouldn't be طرفين. إضافة, right. So the noon and the إضافة don't get together. وغير ذلك, and other times. والمطلق, right, this is the opposite. ما لا يتقيد بزمان. ما لا يتقيد بزمان. It's not limited by time, by place, period of time. ولا مكان, ولا place, ولا وقت. Is waqt and zaman the same thing here? Could be.
Is zaman more general and waqt specific? Maybe? It's like in a specific time or in a specific instance for waqt? Maybe?
Zaman is generally thought to be like a day, a month. Waqt could be an instant. That's my understanding. Sometimes we have what's called عطف الخاص على العام. when you in English we wouldn't normally do this when we say all of the students came and Mark is actually one of the students, so it would be kind of extraneous for us to say, we know Mark is a student, we don't have to say he came too. But in Arabic you do that actually, where you have a general group and then some subset of that group you can also use it in the conjunction, in the atf, for a meaning, for a rhetorical meaning. To put emphasis on that particular person and so forth. والأحاد, right? Even a particular state. فمنه ما هو ثناء على الله كما في كل واحدة من هذه الكلمات. So some of them are praise for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just as in the following, each one of the following words: Subhanallah, walhamdulillah, wa la ilaha illallah, wallahu akbar, wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billahi al-'aliyyil 'azim. So these are all praising of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in different ways. Subhanallah, right, is declaring that all that we can think that is not that is delimiting and inappropriate is completely beyond Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's called in Arabic kalimat tanzih. That's sometimes it's translated as transcends, but transcends has some theological implications in Christianity that may not work for us. But it means something that, because transcends means outside of. So Allah is not really outside of the world or inside of the world. He's not of the world, period. So there's no inside and outside. He's not delimited by positioning relative to the world. So the transcend word kind of has that implication. But for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is, we would have n/a, not applicable. It's completely not applicable, the idea of time and place. Because He was there, and there was no time and place. كان الله ولا شيء معه وهو الآن على ما عليه كان. There was Allah and nothing with Him. And here la shay, nothing means nothing really. No time, no place, no universe.
He created time.
He created time and space. So He cannot be delimited by time and space if He created them. So when we say Subhanallah, we're affirming that. Subhanallah. Walhamdulillah. Right here, Alhamdulillah is affirming that anything that is worthy of being praised returns to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because the alif lam in hamd is a particular type of alif lam. That's why when it's translated, if you read most of the translations of the Quran in the first ayah of Fatiha, it says all praise is due to Allah. But here it says Alhamdu. Why did it say that when it could have said Kulul hamd, all of the hamd? But it says Alhamd. Because in Arabic, the alif lam can take on a meaning of what's called an istighraq, which means anything that's called praise, any specific or general type of praise, is due to God only. No one else. وَلَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهُ we talked about. وَاللَّهُ أَكْبَرُ. Allahu Akbar presents some theological conundrum for the Arabic linguists. Why? What type of word is Akbar? I want one of the students. Where's the level 3 students? Not to put you on the spot.
It's a comparison, or it can be an
Yes,
emphatic.
comparison or ism tafdeel. So what's the definition of comparison?
Compared to something else.
Compared to something else, right? So when I say Fulan akbar min, Zaydun akbar min Ahmad, I'm either saying he's older than him or bigger than him. In other words, the idea that size or age is a common attribute between the two. And I'm stating that in one person it's more than the other. That's ism tafdeel, right? Tafdeel, I prefer one over the other in a particular attribute of the attributes. Why was then that problematic when we say Allahu Akbar?
No,
As if something else also has.
As if something else has a common attribute with God, which is what? Impossible. Impossible. So it's not, I don't mean to say problematic, like, oh wait, something wrong with it. But when you compare the two disciplines, the grammar discipline, and then you get into here the theology discipline, the theologians will say, we don't say, this is, we would say, هذا اسم تفضيل على غير بابه. We would say this is ism tafdeel, but not in the sense, not used in the sense that the grammarians are talking about, because we do not acknowledge that there's any common attributes between God and anything else to begin with. So some of them said Allahu Akbar, yani Akbar, without comparing him to anyone else. And some of them said, no, Allahu Akbar min kulli shay, bigger than everything else, without also attributing common attribute between him and anything else. So the important part is we understand that there's no common attributes between God and
So that's not the only time that we have Ism al-Tafdeel associated with Allah. What about like Surah al-Deen?
Tamam, same thing.
So like there you actually have what it's comparing to, the Hakimeen.
Arhamur Rahim.
Or Arhamur Rahim.
Right, so what do you do in that situation?
Here they say that ishtiraq, good question. The ishtiraq is lafzi. That's where it ends. In other words, the commonality is only in the name. In the sense, so I might call this person Rahim, and I call Allah Rahim, but that's where the commonality ends, and that I use the same word to indicate it. Outside of, but in the mahiyya, remember mahiyya, the reality, the essence of it, there's no commonality. It's only that language is limited, right? And language is limited. Language is limited. In other words, there are meanings out there that maybe I don't have the language to elaborate on with it, that I can't explain it in terms of language. And that's quite possible, right? Because the meanings, kalimatullah, which in other words, the meanings that Allah can send us are endless, never end. Yet language is limited, finite. So that means there might be things out there I can't put in the frame of language. So you can think of this as kind of one of those points where we're forced to use the same word sometimes indicate, attributes of human beings or created things, and similar names in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But then that's also, I wouldn't say forced, but it's by design. Because how else would we be able to appreciate these attributes if we didn't see some semblance of them? We had a frame of reference for them in life. What would we know rahmah to mean if we didn't have some idea what rahmah, mercy, means in life? And then when we apply it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we just know it's rahmah, but it's such a complete and perfect form beyond our comprehension. Beyond our comprehension. And so when we talk about the positive attributes, because we have negative attributes and positive attributes. The positive attributes, we're talking about something where we think of them as complete and perfect. Negative attributes are easier to deal with because they're negations. Right? So one of the negative attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that in wahdaniyya, for example, that He is one. That's easy. All you have to do is negate anything else being a deity except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So even in Christian theology, it's called kaphactic or apophactic theology, it takes precedence over the positive theology, because when you negate something, and this is shown in the Shahada, La ilaha, for example, we begin with a negation or removal of something. So negative theology is more absolute in that it's easier to comprehend. So most books of Aqidah, for example, they talk about Sifat al-Salbiyya, which are the 5 negative attributes that they talk about, which include the Wahdaniyya, which include Qiyamihi bin Nafs, Adam al-Mathal al-Hawadith. He's not like anything else. These things are included in the
Basic and mythical shape.
basic information.
That's the answer.
So Allahu Akbar, right? And it's significant that we start the prayer with Allahu Akbar, because it's kind of putting you in the mode, frame that you should be, that stop thinking about everything else. Because now you're entering into the prayer, and it's only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَلَا حَوْلَ وَلَا قُوَّةَ إِلَّا بِاللَّهِ الْعَلِيِّ الْعَظِيمِ. We talked about this a little bit last night. حَوْلَ وَالْقُوَّةَ. وَمِنْهُ. What's the hat here? What's it talking about? From what? In the dhikr. It's important with you to keep track of your pronouns. sometimes you get lost and you're like, on what are you talking about? So منه من الذكر ما هو ذكر فيه دعاء, where there's a supplication. And dua in Arabic language simply means a request from the lower to the higher. You'll notice in Arabic language that the command form of the verb is used in 3 different ways, they say. But again, it's an interpretive exercise. So depending on who's speaking to whom, who's asking whom, it can be a dua or it could be a command. Right? When we say in Surah Al-Fatiha, Ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim. Ihdina, what type of verb is that? Fa'al amr. Are we commanding Allah? Commanding Him to guide us to the straight path? No. We are supplicating to Him. But because of our relative position to Him, it's interpreted and understood, it's a dua, it's not a command. Right? But when it's higher to lower, when Allah speaks to us, when He says aqimus salat, that's also a fa'al amr. Is He supplicating to us? A'udhu billah? No. He's commanding us to do so because it's known His position to us. When they're equals, they call it iltimas. Right. So if I said to Ismail, a'tini ma, can you give me some water? It sounds rude, just give me water. But the Arabs, they didn't have all the, the early Arabs didn't have all these formalities in between, like min fadlak, hafiz lak, mish'arif ish, all these things that, because it was understood, this is iltimas. We're equals, I'm asking him, we're brothers, can you give me some water? He understands it's not
Because he's wearing a kufi too.
he's not, I'm not commanding him to do that.
Is there a difference between talab and dua? Because I've heard for up, it can be used both. Is dua for Allah?
Talab is more general. Talab is general.
More general. And dua
Yeah.
is
Dua is specific. Because you can say talab is also yashmal al-amr. Like in fiqh, when they talk about haram and halal, the definition of such, they would say, or wajib, they would say wajib is talab bi jazm. Sunnah, or the recommended, talab bin ghayri jazm. So talab bi jazm means it's a request, but actually a command with something that is with jazm, in an obligatory sense. And min ghayri jazm is the recommended acts without the obligation. I actually mean that, but
I know. I figured you should get this.
So منه ما هو ذكر فيه دعاء مثل ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا أو أخطأنا. But if we're being really strict, لا تؤاخذنا, is that really فعل أمر?
It is.
Is it?
Oh no, not yet.
It's nahi, right? Grammatically speaking, what's the difference between the two? Grammatically speaking, there's like a huge difference, which is we say that lam in nahi. What does it do to the verb? Majzoom. So it's still mu'rab. Amma fa'al al-amr is what? Mabni. They took mabni mu'rab, right?
Yeah,
Some of it. So grammatically, it's kind of very specific, but generally speaking, we would say that a command or a prohibition, or asking for one, when we ask Allah, لا تؤاخذنا, do not take us into account when we make a mistake or we forget, that's a type of dua. Because we are asking for something still, even though we're asking for something not to happen. So it includes both. When you ask for something positive or you ask for a negative to be So منهم ما ذكر فيه دعاء أو مناجاة. Right, munajah means more like a plea, I would say. Like you're having this conversation with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's sort of maybe an i'tiraf, an acknowledgement of your weakness. That's a type of munajah. Like when we mentioned last night about the munajah that the Prophet ﷺ had after Ta'if. إن لم يكن بك علي غضب فلا أبالي. Is that a dua specifically? Is he asking for something? No, it's a plea. Right? If there is no anger from you towards me, then nothing else matters. That's a type of munajah. وكذلك اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وهو أشد تأثيرا في قلب المبتدئ من الذكر الذي لا يتضمن المناجاة. So he's saying the salah on the Prophet ﷺ is a type of munajah. Even though there's an implicit request, because the word Allahumma, it actually means Ya Allah. Allahumma means Ya Allah. This is also a type of naht, in a sense. Something that even predated Islam. This was a term that even the pre-Islamic Arabs would use. They used to say, instead of Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, they would say Bismik Allahumma. Like when Suhail ibn Amr did the treaty of Hudaybiyah with the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ wanted to write the Basmala. He said, "You don't know this Rahman ar-Rahim you're talking about, otherwise we'll be Muslim." So they changed it to Bismik Allahumma. لأن المناجي, now he's giving us a reason. لأن المناجي يشعر قلبه بقرب من يناجيه ومما يؤثر في قلبه يلبسه الخشية. لأن المناجي, his heart feels the closeness of the one that he is having this inner conversation with, the object of the munajat. And the Muhaqqiq, he says, لأن فيه ذكر الله ودعاء والصلاة على سيدنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وتعظيمه صلى الله عليه وسلم واستحضاره بهيبته. So you're actually asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to offer his blessings and salutations upon Muhammad صلى الله عليه وسلم. And he said this is أكثر تأثيرا, it's more influential for the person making the dhikr in the beginning, because it has munajat. It has these aspects of it, of this sort of plea and secret inner conversation with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَمِمَّا يُؤَثِّرُ فِي قَلْبِهِ, it affects his heart, وَيُلْبِسُهُ الْخَشْيَةِ, and places khashya, right? In other words, al-basahu actually means to cover something or to dress it. So it means to dress it in khashya. The heart becomes encompassed in reverence and humility. ومنه ما هو ذكر فيه رعاية أو طلب دنيوي أو أخروي. فرعاية مثل قوله الله معي الله ناظر إلي الله يراني، فإنه فيه رعاية لمصلحة القلب، فإنه ذكر يستعمل تقوية الحضور مع الله تعالى وحفظ الأدب معه والتحفظ من الغفلة والاعتصام من الشيطان الرجيم وحضور القلب مع العبادة. So this last type that he mentions here, the dhikr of ri'aya, and ri'aya means you're reminding yourself that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala yura'ik, right? Where do we see the word ra'i before? Ra'i al, herder, yes, ra'i al-ghanam. So the ra'i, you know, what does the shepherd actually do? Like, what does he actually do?
Keeps an eye on
He gets to keep an eye on the whole herd, right? Flock, not herd, flock of sheep. So he keeps an eye on the whole flock all day, right? And he has to make sure they have enough water, they have enough to eat. If the field they're grazing from doesn't have enough, he has to take them somewhere else. So he is fully responsible for all of the affair of the sheep. That's the ri'ayah, because it's a ri'ayah tam. It's like the complete invasive level of care for the one that is in mura'ah, the one that you're taking care of. which is called the ra'iyya. The ra'iyya is the one being taken care of. A ra'i is the one who's doing that. Similar to the hadith of the Prophet kullukum ra'i. Right? All of you are a ra'i in some form or fashion. So if you have a family to take care of, you're a ra'i for your family. If you're a leader, if you're in a position of political power, then you are a ra'i for the people who are underneath your rule. So ra'iyya is reminding yourself, because you say, Allahu ma'i, Allah is with me. Allahu nadhirun ilayya. Allah sees me, He's looking at me. Allahu yarani. Right? فإنه فيه رعاية لمصلحة القلب. In it, implicit in it, there is this ri'ayah for the benefit of the heart. To remind the heart, to keep it, tell it, wait, Allah is watching you, be careful. Don't just think no one can see you because you're alone, but Allah is there, He's watching you. فإنه ذكر مستعمل لتقوية الحضور مع الله تعالى. It's a type of dhikr that is used so that you can strengthen your presence of heart with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وحفظ الأدب. حفظ الأدب means assuming the proper etiquette, the adab of dealing with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَالتَّحَرُّزْ مِنَ الْغَفْلَةِ, right, and avoiding ghafla or disremembrance. وَالْاعْتِصَامُ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ, right, and seeking refuge from the shaitan. وَحُضُورُ الْقَلْبِ مَعَ الْعِبَادَاتِ, and also the presence of the heart in all of the devotional acts of ibadat, plural of ibadah, which includes prayer and fasting and hajj and so on. So this looks like a good place to stop. Maybe we'll do the breakdown, and if there's questions, we'll take them at the beginning of the next session. Is that cool?
It's an interesting
You go back to
Yeah. Actually, never.
so you save all your break time until the end of the day.
Even in because we just never got to that. So we always even in yeah, we just never like 6 semesters then introduced to us. Or maybe it wasn't the last semester. Maybe there was
They're still with the same yeah, they're more. So you work just like